Well, good day, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Frank de Jong. Frank lives in many aspects a thought-out life. For instance, he worked only half days during most of his teaching career, which liberated time to work for many social and political causes. He also goes on many long canoeing adventures and takes extended bicycle trips in the summer months. The trade-off is less income, which he thought was a very good bargain. Frank always did more than his share at everything, and something I really appreciated. We had an introduction through the Green Party of Ontario, and after he moved to Ottawa, our friendship grew, and we spent a lot of time talking and thinking together, often on a canoe trip or while hiking. Once at Temagami, we were arrested with others for blocking a logging road to protest the government-sanctioned but still unconscionable looting of an old-growth forest. Frank is a very social person and gets along with almost everyone. Frank was the leader of the Green Party of Ontario for 16 years, and during that time there were many ups and downs, but Frank always met them with good humor and without rancor, something I could not have done. In his time as GPO leader, he took it from being a small conglomerate of unfocused and disorganized chapters into a functioning party. And then he helped build it, which is even more important. The most important thing about Frank in my books is that he spends a lot of time outdoors, more in a year than most people do in a decade. This is important because much of his thinking is therefore ground-proofed and checked against reality. It's something which many miss. He goes on extended northern canoe trips and, at least until recently, bicycles everywhere. All this outdoor activity leads to a man with a healthy body, mind, and spirit. Before I met Frank, he worked for the peace and social justice movements and is still informed by some of their thinking. He also understands how the Earth's natural systems work and how both life and its landscape are important. He's an ecocentrist in much of his thinking. Frank found Georgism at some stage after he moved from Ottawa, I think, and has since both studied and promoted it. Although we discussed it, I never really understood it. So I'm looking forward to this talk. Allow me to present you Frank de Jong.
Thank you, Ian. That was a very generous introduction. Just as a disclaimer here, Ian and I are actually excellent friends and have been for decades. And I think, Ian, almost in 20 years, we went on a 10-day canoe trip every summer. So we had plenty of time to talk about the vagaries of the world and governments and all that. Yes, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome, and thank you to all who logged in today. I'm honored to be here. I'm going to be talking about economics, and I think it was Mike Nickerson who put me onto the idea of speaking to the Canadian Association Club of Rome. So thank you to Mike Nickerson, another colleague of mine for more years than either of us wants to admit. Before this talk, Ian mentioned to me that I should start my talk with a little joke. And the joke is, if we don't have an economic collapse soon, something terrible is going to happen. and I know Mike knows that one as well. And I first heard that from Richard Thomas. Some of you may know that name. He lives up in Berks Falls, and he ran for the Liberal Party leadership and lost to Peterson. He was first became a bit of a known character in Ontario for brewing his own booze to run his car on ethanol, and he got busted for that. So that was his claim to fame. So I know that I'm speaking about economics today, and of course economics is the dismal art or dismal science, whatever. And but I wanted to clarify at the very beginning that I know full well that economics is derivative. It follows our worldview and our morality. It doesn't precede. So today I'm going to be talking about an alternative economic system or tax structure, et cetera. But I know full well it has to be preceded by a worldview change. Otherwise, it'll never happen, because that's the way it works the other way. Yeah, my main point to make at the very beginning of this talk is that morality comes first and economics is second. For up until now, we've held the colonial worldview, and the colonial worldview was followed by an economic system that delivered what this worldview demanded. And that worldview was to demand an economic system that will enslave other races and entire continents. And indeed, it's working very well. Most crime, ill health, and social dysfunction are poverty-based, and the incidence of climate chaos is increasing, not to mention precarious economic conditions. To date, economic systems, whether capitalist, socialist, or communist, have been vehicles designed to plunder the earth and its weaker citizens. As well, to date, these same economic systems have been designed to stifle productivity, to cripple innovation, to restrict value-added production, to undermine competition, and to inflict underemployment and poverty on the majority. To date, global economic systems deny the majority sovereignty over their economic lives. To date, our anti-nature morality has endorsed economics proficient in liquidating one species after another, one ecosystem after another. Presently, the majority are denied their fair share of the fecundity of the earth. They are denied their share of the wealth that nature offers for free. A minority receive their own share, plus, through the tax structure, commandeer the shares of legions of others. I will be arguing today that if our morality now ostensibly includes all humans and a healthy biosphere, we need to redesign the tax structure to deliver this. I'm not much interested in how governments spend money. Much more important, in my opinion, is how governments raise revenue. Today, I'll be arguing for a simple but profound change to the tax structure. I will present the case for financing all levels of government, not by taxing jobs, businesses, or sales, but by capturing economic rent. I will be arguing that governments should use the tax structure as a policy tool to deliver a green, just, and prosperous society. Effecting the switch from taxing the productive economy to collecting the rent of the commons won't be easy. The fox is in charge of the henhouse. It will be a titanic battle equivalent to the multi-decade battle to end slavery, or the multi-decade battle for women's rights, or the multi-decade battles of the environmental movement. The slave owners were in no hurry to end slavery. Men were in no hurry to end misogyny, and the plutocracy will be in no hurry to share the wealth of the commons. It is through our economics that we continue to despoil the planet, decimate biodiversity, suffer from urban sprawl, forestry sprawl, agriculture sprawl, carbon sprawl, gravel pit sprawl. Maldistribution of wealth is a failure of the tax structure. Economics encourage us to pit races against races and nations against nations, labor versus management. But economically speaking, the conflict is actually between owners and renters. We blindly accept false arguments for excessive immigration into Canada. We are already in ecological overshoot. We are a net food importer, and our economy is overly dependent on fossil fuel and resource export. We suffer from the Dutch disease, which means we are continually liquidating our resources and not innovating ourselves. Home ownership is a goal, but our economics give us a dream home with a nightmare mortgage. We necessarily become mortgage slaves. The Vikings violently took their share of the economic rent, and hopefully we can learn to share the economic rent to avoid the violence that the Vikings perpetrated on much of the world in that time. My first slide, and the name of my talk today is The Invisible Green Hand. Now, I put in a few characteristic photos of underused land in the top left. And in the bottom, we have, of course, traffic jams because of our overdependence on automobiles and the car culture. On the right-hand side, I have sensible development. And in the bottom, I have European-style communities, which are all too rare in North America. My premise is, I mean, the joke, of course, is that the invisible hand is picking your pocket. But I would like to give that a little twist and think that there is such a thing as an invisible green hand. So if we set up our tax structure, it will deliver exactly what we in our minds would like to see. Let's see if I can advance this. All right. Economists basically all agree with what I'm saying, that we shouldn't tax jobs, businesses, and sales, and government should be financed by collecting economic rent or capturing economic rent. The very first economist, the first person who is credited as being as thinking carefully and writing extensively about how economics works was Francois Quesnay. Hardly anyone knows about him, but he primarily promoted exactly what I'm talking about. He coined the phrase laissez-faire. He was a member of the physiocrats under Louis XV. He suggested that if you tax labor, you will reduce productivity. In fact, you're punishing people for having jobs. But if you put the taxes on land, then there is no decline in output. Now, this is, self-evident to all of us. Francois Quesnay inspired Adam Smith to write The Wealth of Nations, and Adam Smith also agreed with this idea. So from the very beginning, we've had a tax structure, exactly what I'm talking about, and that was popularized and established first by Francois Quesnay. Yet here we are today, 300, 400 years later, and we still do not depend on this tax structure that's widely promoted by or articulated by virtually every important economist. Adam Smith, another one, he's calling we should put taxes on land and resources, which are inelastic, and the tax can't be passed on to anyone else. Joseph Stiglitz, he's probably the main reigning economist these days. The factors that demonstrate inelastic supply, land and resources, resource rents, should be used to finance government. Yet why don't we do that? We do collect some economic rent. I'm sure everybody knows that. There are some royalties and some fees, but by and large, most of government revenue comes from the productive economy, not from the non-productive economy. This is Winston Churchill. Land monopoly is not the only monopoly, but it is by far the greatest of monopolies. It is a perpetual monopoly, and it is the mother of all other forms of monopoly. Unearned increments in land are not the only form of unearned and undeserved profit, but they are the principal form of unearned increment. And they are derived from processes which are not merely not beneficial, but positively detrimental to the public. I have made speeches by the yard on the subject of land value taxation, and you know what a supporter I am of that policy. When Winston Churchill says land monopoly, everyone who owns their own house is a monopolist of the land where their house sits, their property. Every farmer is a land monopolist. Everyone who owns a bit of land. You have control over this land within, of course, regulations, municipal regulations, etc. But the police will keep others off that land. And so anyone who owns land should be compensating the rest of us for the privilege of owning that land. So if you go out and buy a couple 100,000 acres of bush, you should compensate others for the privilege. If you own a large lot in downtown and everyone else has to drive by that lot, they should be compensating you for the privilege of owning that land. Here's our old friend Arthur Pigou. He says Pigouvian taxes are a tax levied to correct the negative externality. That means like taxing cigarettes or a carbon or a part of a carbon tax. Anything we want to get rid of, we tax. So by that to continue his argument, if we put a tax on jobs, i.e. income taxes, it means we want to get rid of jobs. But that's complete opposite. We don't want to get rid of it. If we tax businesses, it means we want to get rid of businesses. We want to punish them so they'll go out of business. If we tax sales and services, it means really we want to get rid of those sales and services. So it's a very perverse thing to apply taxes to the items that we want. My first economic thinking came through the Green Party, and our entire economic program was tax bads, not goods. So we're supposed to tax the bad stuff and not the good stuff. But then it begs the question, well, what is good and what is bad? Well, there are businesses. So if businesses are bad, we should tax them. We should increase the business tax. But if businesses are good, we should lift the business tax. Whereas a lot of Greens their notion is that we should increase the business tax greatly, which means punishing the businesses that we want to exist. And we want all green type environmentalists want a job. So why are we punishing someone for having a job? It begs these questions. It's quite fascinating. I was introduced today as someone promoting Henry George. And yes, I am. Henry George was, he's only one of the people, one of the economists who are promoting land value capture and resource value capture. He was very famous in the second half of the 19th century. He wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, and that book sold more copies than any book except the Bible in the second half of the 19th century. He was an amazing speaker. He traveled widely. He was one of these Renaissance people like Rudolf Steiner. He ran for the mayor of New York and almost won. So the tax upon land values is therefore the most just and equal of all taxes. It is the taking by the community for the use of the community of that value, which is the creation of the community. So land has value because people want to live there. And so it's the person who owns it doesn't create the value of the land. They have monopoly over that land, but they don't create its value. It is the community that creates the value. So if you own land, you should compensate the community for keeping everyone else off of it, off of your land. Herbert Simon, assuming that a tax increase is necessary, it is clearly preferable to impose the additional cost on land by increasing the land tax rather than to increase the wage tax. So once again, he articulately and clearly and unequivocally states it is unadvisable or perverse or dumb to tax jobs, and we should put the tax on inelastic assets, non-replicatable inelastic assets. Henry George, economic rent is revenue without a corresponding cost of production, ideal to finance government. That's the whole point here. When someone owns an asset, whether it's an oil well or a gravel pit or land, there's nothing you can do to increase the value of that resource. It's only the community that will increase its value. Therefore, the rental value of that land, the rental value of that gravel, of that oil, belongs to the community because it's created by the community and should accrue back to the community, to the community in lieu of punishing perverse deadweight taxes on jobs, businesses, and sales. Henry Ford, we ought to tax all idle land the way Henry George said, tax it heavily so that Its owners would have to make it productive. That's what happens when you increase the land tax, then it will not stay idle, because the owner, it will cost them more money than it's worth. And the owner will be forced by this tax to bring that land into production, or else sell it to someone else who will. And Henry Ford was familiar with this, and he articulated it. Taxes on buildings and enterprise. Oh my goodness. Sorry, I didn't even know I had that on. Sorry. Taxes on buildings and enterprise, while vacant lot owners wait for land values to rise. This again demonstrates what I was referring to. The person who owns this land is doing nothing to it, and they don't create the value of this land. It's the community that creates it. And as the community grows and gets more productive, this land will become more and more value, and that's what we obviously call speculation. And yes, not only are vacant lots used for speculation, but churches, when a new community is built, they buy a large plot of land and use it as a church, and then they get tax free status. And then 20, 30, 50 years later, they can sell that land for a tremendous amount of money, and they did not earn that. So this is an interesting one. Clean air is our right, and yet everyone who pollutes the air is compensating, is impinging on the right of everyone who wants to breathe. So that's where the argument for the carbon tax comes in, because if you pollute someone else's air, you should compensate the community, or compensate that person through the government for the privilege of polluting. Polluting is not a right, it's a privilege, and you should pay for the privilege. Land value taxation is LVT is the title given to this, but actually collecting the value of land is actually not a tax at all. A tax is like a Pigouvian tax. It's something put on something or an activity to discourage it. So land value capture does not discourage the use of that land. In fact, it increases the value of that, it increases the productivity of that land. But anyway, the idea of land value taxation has stuck. LVT, it should be land value capture, or even more accurately, rental value capture. And so it's a tax shift, and it's to shift off buildings and onto the rental value of the land alone. So right now, the municipal tax, for instance, is a combination of two taxes. It is a tax on the building, the improvements as they're known, and it is the tax on the land. But what I'm saying today is that we should ignore the buildings. The tax assessors should ignore the buildings and shift the entire municipal tax exclusively onto the land below the building. And so that would incent more buildings on less land and address sprawl. It's a critical component. It's a market mechanism to address sprawl. I mean, you do it. It's easy to understand this when you do a thought experiment. If you imagine that all the taxes are on the building and none is on the land, then people will oversize their lots and buy double lots and triple lots and quadruple lots right downtown, because it's free to own land. And if all the taxes are on buildings, then people will say, well, I'm going to live in a very tiny house and have a huge lot, which is not what you want in towns. You want it to be used efficiently. And so if you're in your thought experiment, if you say, okay, let's shift all the municipal taxes onto the building and none onto the land, then homeowners will say, wow, okay, if I move to a smaller lot, I can avoid a lot of taxation. And if I rebuild my house, renovate, extend the building, the size of my footprint, then I will not face taxation. Because right now, the municipal tax punishes people for adding buildings to their lot and creating more rental places, etc. And that's a perverse tax. So it's a revenue neutral shift. And I'm not saying we have to do it overnight, but it could be shifted over 5 or 10 years so that people can plan for it. Question is, with land value taxation, how would that impact farming, housing, retail, cities, jobs? And the same thing, it would encourage people to use less land and fewer resources and do more value-added production, which is exactly what we want. So it's, again, an elegant market mechanism to achieve the goals of a just society and a prosperous society. There are two kinds of assets. There are house-like assets and land-like assets. House-like assets depreciate. So why would you tax something that depreciates? It makes no sense. Cars, factories, clothes, furniture, computers, cows, sales jobs, businesses. As soon as you tax them, they'll go away. And houses, you know, they depreciate at 1% per year, et cetera. So, but what then land-like assets are assets that are finite, non-replicatable, and desirable. And that's where the taxes should move to. Oil, water, quotas, minerals, electromagnetic spectrum, billboards, land, air rights, etc. Taxi medallions, taxi licenses. There's a whole range of other things in the land-like assets to think about, to compare. Air rights, another one is landing slots at airports. These are finite and could bear a heavier burden of taxes. So the whole notion of what I'm speaking about today is that we should shift all the taxes off of the house-like assets and onto land-like assets. And that would inspire a virtual spiral towards equity, careful management and use of the planet, and social justice. Adam Smith. The landlord, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent for even the natural produce of the earth. So that's what happens when you don't tax nature and you don't tax the land, the house, the land-like assets, and people buy them up. And then they exploit the people who want to use them, or more likely are forced to use them. So this goes back to Adam Smith, who learned it from Francois Quesnay. The very first and fundamental economists all understand exactly what I'm talking about. And it goes on from there, but yet it doesn't happen. It's like, you know, people realized we shouldn't have slavery. We shouldn't be enslaving the blacks, etc. But it took hundreds of years to get rid of it. And it's the same problem with economic rent capture. We're getting nowhere, and it's an idea that's several hundred years old already. It's an elegant market-based mechanism to achieve a just, green, and prosperous planet that we are not putting into effect. It's a human tragedy and an ecological tragedy. This is today's property tax. If you improve your building and keep it in good shape, your taxes go up. So we punish you for being a good proprietor, a good landlord, a good homeowner. But if you let your building degrade and fall apart, the taxman says, "Oh, you're being a very bad citizen. We're going to reduce your taxes." You know, this is ridiculous. And so that's the situation right now. We have perverse ideas of what we should tax. And this is what land value taxation does. It ignores the building. It ignores whether your building is in good shape or dilapidated, and you pay the same tax. And this goes for farmers too, or every industry. It doesn't matter what you're making on that land, all the taxes are on the land. And this will inspire efficient use of land and reduce sprawl. And also it will inspire using smaller amounts of land more efficiently, and we can leave way more land to nature. And this is the case with gravel pits, with farmland, with forestry, with virtually any resource. If you, let's say when a community is started like 200 years ago, there's this bit of land and it's got a gravel pit on it, but but nobody bothered buying that land because it was basically swamp and rock and a bit of gravel. So everyone in the community would just go get a bunch of gravel there whenever they needed to with their horse and wagon. And the gravel was free because it was a gift of nature and everyone had equal access to this gift of nature. But then as things progressed, somebody said, well, I'm going to buy that land. There is a little bit of productive land, plus it has a gravel pit and I can start charging people for gravel. So this person started, put a price on their gravel, and then everyone in town had to go 110 kilometers further to get free gravel. So they had to waste a lot of time and fossil fuels to go get free gravel, or they could pay this person for the gravel on the land that they bought, even though the person didn't make the gravel and doesn't just sits there in a rocking chair getting payments. And then a few years later, somebody else buys the 10-kilometer away gravel pit, and so everyone has to drive 100 kilometers to get free gravel. So the first guy will charge $20 instead of 10 and to get to above the zero. So this is how it worked with the free gifts of nature. Yes, they should be charged for to encourage conservation, and that revenue should not go to what the individual who owns that land. It should go to the community, which creates the value in the first place. Economic rent is a windfall profit, unearned income. It's community generated. There's no corresponding cost of production. In every economy, roughly 70% of the GDP is earned income, and 30% is unearned income. So this starts to give you a sense of how much of the GDP goes to the monopolists and the speculators. 30% of the GDP goes to that kind of activity. That's called unearned income. And these people are rent seekers or rentiers, it's called. We are all tax shifters. When you're a political person who says, oh, we should tax those F-150 trucks, or we should tax bicycles, or we should take the tax. We're all tax shifters, and so am I. And once again, I'm saying we should take the tax off of buildings, off of sales, off of businesses, because we want to encourage those. So why would you punish them with taxes? And we should move the tax burden onto sites, which means land, sources, which means resources, and sinks, which means pollution. So the entire government tax burden in a perfect Henry George world, there would be no taxes on the items on the left, and the entire tax burden would be on the right. But once again, it's a shift. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And of course, there's still room for Pigouvian taxes to encourage people to stop smoking and not drink too much. Earned income belongs to all. Earned income belongs to you. Unearned income belongs to all. So the gravel that's there by a gift of nature belongs to everyone equitably. Or if you don't need the gravel, you should get compensated for someone else using up the community gravel pit. This is what's known as the commons, of course. The tragedy of the commons was it all got divided up into private ownership. And then the community no longer benefited from the commons. Economic rent is a perfect source of government revenue. It also could be distributed as a universal basic income. There's a lot of talk about a UBI these days, but I don't support it unless the UBI is financed out of economic rent, because the argument that most people say, look, I have a job, I work hard, you're going to tax me and then give my money to somebody else who doesn't work. I mean, that's the right wing, the social conservative or whatever. That's the hard line on that. But the point is, there's truth to it, and we shouldn't tax someone for earning income. If you earn income, you should be able to keep all that income. But if you are collecting unearned income that doesn't belong to you, that should be socialized for everyone's benefit. If we put together a universal basic income now, it'll be redistribution, which means people earn income, government takes it and then redistributes it. And that's a hateful thing to do. we should distribute wealth properly in the first place, then we do not have to redistribute it afterwards. And if people understand where that economic rent is unearned income, then they realize, well, I didn't earn that, so I guess it has to go to government, and it can be used for a basic income or to finance government programs. In Canada, we have these hated transfer payments. I mean, they're loved by Newfoundland and a few other provinces, but they're hated by Alberta, etc. And the reason is Alberta has this huge gift of nature, which of course is oil, and they think they earn all this money that comes from oil, but they don't. It belongs to all Canadians, or indeed it belongs to all humans, all citizens of the earth. And of course, we shouldn't use it at all. Of course, that's beside the point. But yes, resources and land are the birthright of all citizens. Ontario, for instance, does not have oil, but we have land. So land is our oil. The government of Ontario and Canada, or whatever, the government of Ontario could generate all of its revenue from the rent of land by capturing the unearned income that accrues to land. And Ontario has no need whatsoever to tax businesses, sales, or jobs in this province. Just like Alberta could use the revenue from oil to alleviate, and has, Alberta does not have a sales tax. And of course we know, but most of the revenue from the oil in Alberta goes to the multinationals, whereas in Norway, of course, everybody knows that every new baby Norwegian is automatically a millionaire, because Norway did not give away the golden goose by letting the oil revenue all go to the private corporations. Billionaires pay no tax on unearned income, and people with jobs pay tax on earned income. There's no way to get rich unless you collect unearned income. Everybody knows that. There's virtually no job that ever pays enough, because jobs are replicatable. If you're charging too much money, they'll just fire you and hire someone else. But if you own an asset that is desirable and finite, you can charge whatever you want. It's like the old story of Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe owned the whole island, and he had the whole island to himself. He owned it all. And then Friday came along, and Robinson Crusoe didn't say, "Oh, now there's two of us. Here's your half of the island, because you're a human and I'm a human. We have to share the island equitably." No, Robinson Crusoe enslaved poor man Friday. So that's a very simple way of describing the situation on Earth today. When we use land value taxation in agriculture, we change the land to building ratio. Right now, there's a lot of land is being cash cropped, and there's hardly anyone working on it or living on it. You know, one farmer these days, one person runs 10,000 or 20,000 acres, whereas because the technology allows it. Whereas if we had land value taxation, then it would encourage people to put more buildings on land and use it more intensely. You know, even around Toronto, all this wonderful farmland is all corn and soy and corn and soy. And that land should be used for agri-education, agri-vacations, people should be on that land doing things, niche agriculture, local agriculture. Right now, land value taxation punishes farm production, because as soon as you put up another building, your taxes go up. LVT is pro-business, it's land efficient. When businesses are land efficient, it frees up a lot of land for other businesses. So it gives access to land for other businesses, which now that land is so expensive because of the upfront cost. And as soon as there's land available, then you have more business startups. And as soon as you stop taxing jobs, business owners hire more people, and you have more innovation, more division of labor. And that's where the real money comes from. We shouldn't punish businesses for being successful. Urban design, sprawl, decay, automobiles, isolation, social isolation. I'm not sure what more abundance is in there for. unaffordable. That will all get changed to vibrancy, transit, walkable communities, prosperity, affordable. Now, land value taxation is not a magic bullet. It still costs the same amount to hold a piece of land as before. It's not a freebie, except that there will be no upfront cost, because instead of getting a mortgage at a bank for, you know, $500 or $1 million for the land portion of your property, you would go to the bank only for the building portion of your property, because you don't need a mortgage for the land, which is at least half in Ontario. Half of the value of a property is land. Your mortgage should be cut in half because you don't need a mortgage for the land part. But what you have to do is you have to sign in the dotted line to submit your land value tax monthly to the government. So presently, we pay twice. We pay the mortgage and we pay income taxes. And after we shift all the taxes off of jobs and businesses and sales and onto land, you would pay once to the government for the land portion of your property instead of paying twice. So it'd be a huge difference to everyone. Shift taxes off improvements and onto land value or rental value of land. Your taxes fund the infrastructure that makes my land more valuable. So you're a developer or a speculator, you buy a piece of land on the edge of town, you wait 5 or 10 years, the government rezones it, your land goes up 10 or 20 or 50 times in value. They put roads by it, they put infrastructure into it, sewers and water, and you did nothing. You slept the whole time, rocking in your rocking chair, but you earned massive amounts of unearned income. That's that you are a rentier. You are a rent seeker. It's called, and that should be illegal. I just heard the other day that in Australia they have a new law that any land on the edge of town that is rezoned, 100% of the land value upkick is stripped away and goes to government. It doesn't go to the developers anymore. Self-financing infrastructure. Where there is warranted infrastructure, that infrastructure raises the value of land all around or affected by that infrastructure, whether it's transit or a new hospital or a park or a school. And so everyone living around that government-sponsored infrastructure, their land goes up in value. And so that's unearned income. So all these landowners their land goes up dramatically because of the new infrastructure. And yet everyone who doesn't own land also has to help pay for this infrastructure, which is an injustice. So the renters who don't own any land and don't collect any unearned income have to help pay. So under land value taxation, infrastructure pays for itself because the rise in land value around that infrastructure is captured by government to pay for that infrastructure. So people in the far end of town don't help pay for your infrastructure. You pay for your own infrastructure with the land value uptick. Tax wealth, not work. That's sort of self-evident, yet there's very little of that going on. We do have a progressive income tax system, but there was an article in the paper today in the Globe that was it something like 15% of wealthy people don't pay any tax at all. I talked already about a universal basic income. This, of course, is a little clip, a little photo from Waiting for Godot, that famous Samuel Beckett play. End of universal basic income should be funded out of economic rent capture instead of by taxing people who actually earn their income. Africa is not poor, Africa is being looted. This also, everybody on this group understands that. Africa is tremendously wealthy. I mean, it has tremendous resources, but they are all monopoly owned by foreigners dramatically, who collect all the the unearned income associated with that, and the locals who work there do not get their fair share. But that happens in Canada too, everywhere. There's always when people are earning a lot of money, they always try to hide it offshore, and governments are always trying to say, "Oh yes, we're going to clamp down on that and make sure that you can't move your profits offshore." And there's a little efforts made here and there, but basically doesn't change anything. But if we had governments that were financed by land and resources, there's that will completely solve the problem, because you can't move the tax base out of the country. So this is another a market mechanism that solves a lot of problems, solves this whole offshoring problem of resources. Another thing that land value taxation does, it gets rid of the underground economy, the informal economy, because I know half a dozen people who are tradespeople especially, and they do everything in cash because they can avoid taxes. So that's all fine and good, but it's not fair to people who can't avoid paying taxes because it's payroll deductions. So if you shift the taxes off of people, then any money you own, whether it's cash or through your payroll, you get to keep it, and it brings it moves the underground economy above ground. So it solves that whole 20% of our economy is roughly underground economy, which is a huge component, which is real injustice that this money doesn't help pay for everything. This is a really good, really interesting slide that really clarifies exactly what I was been going on about. So it doesn't matter which system. In capitalism, the individual gets the rent, the wages, and the interest, shared unequally, of course, and a small slice of each one goes to society. Here we collect a little bit of rent, we collect wages, taxes on wages, and taxes on businesses. Under socialism, half and half, that's an approximation, of course. Under communism, a little bit goes to the individual, but there's still, the rent is not shared equally in communism or socialism, much like it's not in capitalism. The rent is always unequally goes to the owners of assets that are non-replicatable and finite and desirable. Under Georgism, the rent goes to society, and individuals get to keep all the wages they earn and all the interest they earn. Don't you love graphics that can clarify all this foggy stuff? I believe, oh, there. I think this is my last slide, I'm not sure. Bertrand Russell. The mere abolition of rent would not remove injustice, since it would confer a capricious advantage upon the occupiers of the best sites and the most fertile land. It is necessary that there should be rent, but it should be paid to the state or to somebody which performs public services. Or if the total rental were more than is required for such purposes, it might be paid into a common fund or divided equally among the population. Alberta has a very small heritage fund. Norway has trillions and trillions. And at the bottom line is talking about how rent can be used as a UBI, a universal basic income. That's very prescient and thoughtful of Bertrand Russell. I believe that's the end of my lovely slideshow.
All right, Ian will be coming up and we'll coordinate the question period. Ian?
And get my picture back, but however, yes, I will. There's a few questions already there. I'm going to read you one from John Legg, who wants to ask you a question, but he says there's too much noise in his apartment to do it. So it says, how does your thinking work out when it comes to unbridled immigration, as we have now? Canada used the point system, that is, potential immigrants qualified to immigrate to Canada if their qualifications show that they can contribute to Canada. But the point system is largely, whoops, start my video, okay. But the point system has largely been taken over by the federal politicians vying for the favor of future immigrants when it comes to voting. And B, I may be unable to this question because of the noise. And thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. That was from John Legg.
Yeah, thank you, John. There's a number of points you brought up. For the point system that the federal government uses, what we're doing is predating poor countries and bringing their doctors and their best people here who have money and they can sort of basically buy their way in. And so we're being very damaging to these countries. For one thing, also we are perpetuating a fallacious argument why we need so much immigration to Canada. I know this group, CACOR, talks a lot about population, and I concur. We are bringing in the neighborhood of 400,000 every year now. And we say, well, we have to do that because of to keep our economy going. And we have all these seniors that are being just sponges on the system, et cetera. But I think that's completely fallacious. I don't think that's not necessary at all. Seniors, myself one, we're like a coal mine, you know, there's lots of jobs taking care of seniors. And so the economy would be doing just fine. I don't argue with that. I don't agree with that argument, that economic argument. Also, I think our emphasis should be helping other countries improve the quality of life there. Nobody wants to move to a new country. I mean, the odd person does. My parents came from the Netherlands after the Second World War because it was so demolished and the economy was in shambles. And they thought the only way to ever get a better life would get the heck out of there and come to Canada. Turns out the Netherlands bounced back way faster than Canada. And so the quality of life in the Netherlands is higher than Canada and always has been. So I mean, the Dutch people never move to Canada anymore. They'd be nuts to do so because they got it so good in the Netherlands. And as soon as, if we helped other countries by stopping the predation of their resources and actually helping them instead of hindering their development, then most people would want to stay in their own country because people love where they're born and that's where their friends and family are. There's no reason, most people would never want to move to another country unless they're desperate. So let's make it less desperate for them.
Is that your answer?
That was the answer.
Okay,
I'm sticking to it.
I have Dave Doherty and Raymond Lurie both have the same question, so I'm going to read it out for them. And after that, Art Hunter, and then after him, John Myers. Raymond writes, if forested land is taxed, won't it cause the owner to want to cut it down faster and pay those taxes? And that's, Dave says, what land taxation ought to be placed on wild lands, forest, wetlands, uninhabitable mountain terrain, and so on.
Okay, good point. Second question first, maybe. Excuse me. Wildlands should be taken out of the economy altogether. They should be in parks and reserves. They should be decommodified. If they have ecological value, they should be decommodified. If you own land, yes, you have to pay the taxes. And if you don't use that land efficiently, then you will go broke. So yes, you have to do something productive with that land. And that's the way it should be, because if you are not being productive to this land, you should like sell it or let it go back to nature. The whole effect of land value taxation is it rationalizes the use of land, and land is used to its highest and best use. Otherwise, you'd go broke holding it, and there's no incentive to hold land unless you're using it to highest and best use. So for example, if you have an important corner in a city and it has some low-rise buildings, that's not the highest and best use. Those important corners where the biggest buildings should be, where the transit stops, where the train stations are. And so land value taxation encourages important land to be used intensively so that huge amounts of other land are given back to nature or used for a more appropriate use.
So your answer is that if land is being held away from the cities, it should be no tax, especially if it's being used for reforestation?
Well, see, once again, we're getting to a moral, it becomes a moral thing. We need moral overtones to every economic system. And if your society thinks we need lots of forest land and land left to its own resources, then society should do that. And we're doing that now with land trusts. Most people want far more land left to nature. In fact, you know, we should leave half of the earth to nature, and the other half we should use it very, very carefully. So yes, Ian. If land has important ecological features and values, it should be taken completely out of the economy, like we do now with parks.
Good answer. And I guess we have Art now.
Frank, I extract all the heat for my house from the ground, and that means I have to go and put a heat exchanger in the land next to my house. And under this proposed taxation system means I would have to pay tax for something which is quite natural, because the heat that I am collecting is coming from the nuclear reaction that is happening from the center of the earth. And whereas I presume if I were to take that heat exchanger and put it under a road, then I wouldn't have to pay for it. Is that correct?
Well, so let me just to clarify, you're running your heat exchanger system underneath somebody else's land or under public land?
No, in fact, it's somebody else's land. It's owned by the condominium corporation, and of which I happen to be the president. And there is an agreement that I can run my heat exchanger 8 feet down under the ground that is owned by the condominium corporation. Yes.
Well, then it's totally an in-house situation. That's a deal between you and the condominium situation. I don't think there's the taxman would have anything to do with that whatsoever. What you have, it's called an improvement, and improvements are untaxed. And as far as is the heat you're pumping out of that ground significant? And I think not. I think it's completely irrelevant. But improvements are ignored by the taxman, so I think you're good to go.
Well, I might say that the heat is not insignificant. I heat my house totally this way.
No, I know that.
If you think that's an insignificant,
no. I think it's wonderful what you're doing. I'm jealous, but I mean the amount of heat you take out of the ground is insignificant, and I know it's wonderful that's the way we should all be using heat pumps and get away from gas and oil and propane altogether.
Okay, thank you.
So John Meyer next, and following him, Mike Nickerson, Dave Doherty, and Paul Bulkowski.
Yeah, Frank, thanks very much for that. I never understood land value taxation before, so you explained it pretty well. And I just would like to know how it fits into the overall suite of government finance. Personally, I think I love to see the differentiation between productive and non-productive portions of the economy, the difference between real wealth production and transfer functions, inflation and rent. So all good stuff. But I think one of the things we don't want is consumption. And I think we should have very powerful taxes on consumption, and probably double the tax on consumption for consumer goods produced outside of the country to encourage domestic production. How would you see, what percentage of income, government revenue, would be made through the land value taxation system? Or do you think there would be other need for other streams of revenue?
I understand where you're coming from, John, about consumption. We are a consumer society, and that's a big problem. I think that the consumer society is a cultural problem, not a economic problem. And to some extent, if people had more money, would they buy more stuff? Well, I wouldn't. I know Ian White certainly wouldn't. So I mean, I don't think it's necessarily Henry George always writes that humans like to live as best as they possibly can within their financial, but quality of life means time off work. Quality of life means time out in nature. Quality of life means with loved ones. Most people buy things that they need. Most of the things people buy is because they need them. And so you're punishing people for buying the things they need, which is, again, perverse taxation. So, but okay, let's say, but the thing is, it's a tax shift. So people still have to pay the same amount of taxes. The whole tax shift that I'm talking about is not a giveaway. It's not a tax. It's not a tax-free situation. The average person will pay exactly the same amount. The median person or whatever will pay the same amount of tax now as they do before. They will just be paying it for from a different component of the economy. They'll be paying it for how much land they have and not how much stuff they buy. So they won't have as much money if they're living on a large plot of land to buy stuff that they don't need. It's messy. I don't have a clear answer for you, but
okay. Well, I'll try and that helps me a lot. I'm making a presentation in the middle of June, and I'll spell out better what I think the approach would be, taking into account your answer. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So I guess Mike Nickerson's next. Oh, Mike asleep?
He's
well,
muted.
We can hold Mike off, and Dave Doherty can. Nobody's there.
Yeah. Hi. Oh yeah, I'm here. I'm just going to go past Mike's question to mine. Well, I'm wondering whether Georgism would encourage countries to increase their populations and expand the occupation of currently uninhabited lands, and perhaps political situations would evolve where those parks that you mentioned as being taken out of the economic system would in fact be deregistered as parks and brought back into the economic system because politicians thought that was of benefit to the country.
That's a very complex question because I think the number of children people have is not an economic decision. It's once again moral. It's a sense of family and community. I don't think
if I may, a lot of governments, including the government of Quebec, and I think the government of Canada, and well, maybe certainly the government of Ontario, they offer tax incentives, in fact, benefits to people who have more children, and this is fairly common.
Oh, I know that. I understand that, and I think that's completely ridiculous. Someone talked about it last week on this call. But again, that's a political decision and a moral decision. It's not a tax decision. So you're saying, I mean, what you're effectively saying is, if government gives people more money to have babies, then these people are going to need land to live on. So then we have to take the parks out of circulation. So, but you're blaming the root of the problem is that a government is giving people more money to have babies, or that people still have this notion that that the planet. We're not internalized the notion that we're well over ecological overshoot, and it's a good citizen would have fewer children. So it's not an economic argument, it's a moral one. But the other thing is, when you have land value taxation, land will be used much, much more efficiently, and it will leave an awful lot more land to nature. So yes, there's going to be a shakeout on all these things, and it's a whack-a-mole game to try to figure out the ultimate where it settles down afterwards. But generally speaking, it would be hugely beneficial to nature, because a lot more land and resources would be unsquandered.
Yeah, good answer. Thank you.
Is Mike Nickerson there yet? Well, announce yourself when you are, Mike. I got Paul, and I had Dave down again, but he probably asked this question, and Ted Manning in that order. So Paul Bukowski.
Hi, actually it's Peter.
Oh,
Assuming
sorry.
you got the right person. In the write-up, you referred to pharmaceutical patents as common good. What about all other patents? What about copyrights?
I agree with you. You're right. I could have included others as well. I think pharmaceutical patents are a huge one that's fresh in everyone's mind. But you're right. I should have included. I shouldn't have been specific with pharmaceutical patents. Everybody knows the patent system is designed to give people a return on their investment. The question is, if you're every business has to make an investment to get going, and businesses earned income covers all your costs plus a reasonable profit. If you start a business and you make a 5% ROI, that's earned income still. There's a leeway in there. But if you put in an investment of $100,000 and you have some kind of like a Facebook or a Google, you have something that is what do they call that? It's replicatable. Then at a certain point, your investment is paid back, and you don't need 10 times your investment. So then it becomes economic rent. So if you have a patent which allows you to recoup your investment plus a 5%, that should be the limit. And beyond that, returning your initial investment plus a respectable profit, that becomes rent, which should accrue to the government.
The other half of my question was with regard to copyright, because copyright to me is just a different form of patent. So does a book author, does an artist who's done a painting, their works can then be replicated by anybody else? Copyright disappears as well as patents?
Well, that's an interesting one as well. Sometimes when you trying to research economic rent, they talk about artists or even a hockey player. If that hockey player can demand $1 million and the next lower priced one is $25,000 or $250,000, then $750,000 of that hockey player's salary is rent and should accrue to government. That's one argument, and it's the same with artworks. You know, what is your time worth as an artist to produce? You know, how can you put a price on an artist's time because some artists are good and others are bad, and yet you can't say they're all worth $50 an hour. So, okay, the approach that me and my colleagues around the world in the Georgist world take is that things like artists and authors, we just completely ignore it because it's noise in the system compared to the big ticket items like land and resources. But I know you have a point, and it is an interesting one, but it's virtually impossible to try to quantify what the time of an author is worth to produce a 250-page book. It's a mug's game. And so, yeah, and is there not, you might probably know this better than me, is there not a rule that after 50 years, a movie is common domain and books become common domain after a certain number of years?
After a certain number of years, and it's a large number of years for copyright, 50 or 70, depends upon the country. Patents typically are 20 years.
I know.
So again, how do you value my time as a scientist doing that type of work versus an artist? You've got a lot of complexities there, which in the implementation of your system has a huge number of challenges to deal with.
Well, yes and no. I don't think there are a huge number of challenges. You know, there's an example of what the present governments are wrestling with. You know, came up a few years ago about tips for waiters. And they said, well, the Revenue Canada said, well, we should, people who earn tips should have to pay taxes on that. And then the judges went and said, look, this is small potatoes. It's a mug's game trying to capture this revenue. Let's not go there. And so it's a political decision how long to make a pharmaceutical patent at 20 years. Should it be 15? Should it be 10? Or a book or a novel? How many? It's a political decision, not an economic one. But you could say, like I mentioned with pharmaceutical, once you've paid back your investment plus a respectable profit, then it becomes rent. And so you could say, you could make some arbitrary political decision that after an author makes $100,000 from a book, then everything above that, or 75% of anything above that, is rent and has to be paid in tax. You could go there. It's all fairly arbitrary, and it's complex. You're right.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, Frank, Mike Nickerson writes that he can't make his computer work to show pictures or take sound anymore. So he asked me to read his question or his comment, and it is as follows. Land value taxation has an elegance. I like it if a school is built by my house, or a hospital or a transit stop, the value of my property goes up. With LTV, the upkeep of the school or hospital or transit system would be covered by the increase in property value that those community innovations created. He didn't actually ask a question, but that's his comment. Would you like to comment on that comment, or shall we go to the next comment?
Well, actually, I don't understand it, because, okay, he's saying if like the province builds a hospital in beside where Mike lives, who pays for the upkeep of the hospital? Is that what your question was?
No, it's he says he likes it that his taxation is going to.
Oh, so he's in favor of the idea.
He's in favor, yeah.
Okay, well, it's more, well, the LVT pays for less the operating costs, but it's for the upfront construction costs.
And
but anyway,
you know, to comment on that, they're building the subway right now down the bottom of my street, and the rumor is that the houses around here gone up $250,000 since, and that certainly was unearned by me, I can tell you. And so anyway.
So Ian, so you should give $100,000 to the city of Ottawa by way of compensation.
I should. Just let me live a few more years and I will have. Dave Doherty, no, I got Ted Manning next, and then Dave Doherty says he wants to come on for Gene, or does Gene want to come on now? I headed Ted.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Ted can ask his question first.
Okay, well, I'm going to say first to Ian, what are you going to spend that money on? And
Well,
my
I'm not
guess
selling the
is
house till
your
after I
wish
die.
list is different than other people whose faces you see around this place. Because those of us, some of you don't know, I was the head of land use for Environment Canada for more than 20 years. And we actually spent a lot of time doing such things as setting up the agricultural land reserves in BC, getting some of the coastal areas protected in Prince Edward Island, and looking at land ownership limits. And in most of the work that has tried to keep the fruit lands available in Ontario, among other things. But it all comes back to values, that our biggest issue in any of the things trying to deal with land is that everybody looks at a piece of land and sees different things. If I look at a beautiful point with wildlife on it going out into Lake Huron, I'll immediately say, what a great place to put a Hilton. And its highest and best use has nothing to do with what I'm sure Ian would look at and say, just a minute, there's at least 10 endangered species there. And if we can stop them from eating each other, we'll have a far better value system after the end. Our real issue, one of the best things I ever read on this was de Groot's work, where they'd been looking at essentially what were the real environmental values associated with a place. And how come our society never recognizes 90% of the ones there? If you think it's farmland, you're just valuing the product. And even at the same time, you're asking the farmer to preserve the habitat or to keep the water flowing next door. And our society does not look holistically at any places, even the vacant lot next door to you. Somebody looks at it and sees it as a potential park. Others people say, just a minute, we can make a lot more money off of that by putting in a road racing track. And everybody will have different kinds of attitudes on this. That's why I weighed in, because I think we can't really identify what is the highest and best use. And every time we tried to set up land to be preserved, there were other people trying to get us to pay them for the difference, like they have to in the States. If I down zone your lot, making, because until you can't put an abattoir on it, I have to pay you. Whereas in Canada, we don't because of the niceties of Canadian law. But at the same time, there were major arguments over what were the values that had to go onto that site. And I'll just end with one other observation. The governments, even though in Canada, the government is essentially the owner of the land and they allocate rights to each of us that we get to use it in different ways, it does not really have the ability to tell us where to go or what to do. So if I come wandering along and want to put my Hilton right on that point, generally they won't tell me to go a mile further along where it's not going to destroy habitat and where it might even make more money and where it might have good labor next to it and all kinds of other things. Our governments do not have that kind of power. And even in places where they do, like some of the Caribbean islands that I've been working on, they have a real rough time using it simply because the politics of land is so very important. And every one of us looks at every piece of land differently.
Well, I think you said it really well. You know, with respect to the ecological components, that has to be, I mean, these are again, political decisions and moral decisions. I drive by Long Point, and Long Point, there's a little bit of a provincial park there, but the vast majority of Long Point is owned by Americans apparently. And I think that's a, you know, it doesn't matter whether it was Canadians or Americans, but it's a tragedy that that wonderful place isn't all of it a park, and it should be, they should be expropriated in my humble opinion, and it should be all turned into this this park.
But you can get that to happen if enough Canadians donated a few $100,000 each and told its government to do it.
Well, that is correct. That's why it's a political decision. There was a big issue with, was it Walmart setting up a big, was it Walmart, a big warehouse in the middle of Oshawa on a swamp, and there was a big stink about that, and they removed their application because of the political pressure. So this is political pressure, it's not economics. And you know, ecological values, as we change hopefully to an ecologically based worldview, we will take those kinds of lands, immediately decommodify them and take them out of the economic world altogether.
Thanks, Frank, that's good.
Well, now we have Gene next, and I think John Myers has another question, so he'll be after Gene.
Thank you for a really thought-provoking presentation. You've been focusing primarily on land value rent. And I'm really wondering how, I can understand with land value, it has a known geographic or location and it's static, pretty much static. How would you propose in this kind of a system dealing with things that are more fluid, like water or air, or some of the things that are not based on a particular geographic area? How would you pay rents on something like that?
Well, that's a very good point. It becomes more complicated. But with the whole world is dealing with climate change, and that's primarily because of CO2. So the solution, one of the solutions is a carbon tax. And in Canada, we have the world's first carbon fee and rebate system, which is not a tax, it's a fee and rebate. But anyway, we're putting a price on carbon. And as I said in my talk, that the air is part of the commons. And if anyone pollutes it, same with the water, if anyone pollutes, the point of pollution, where the pollution enters the water, that should be, you should be charged for the privilege of pollution of air and water. But again, it gets messy, and you need assessors who go out and decide how bad it is, what's the nature of it, whether it's, and decide on the price, right? We have assessors for everything, so there's no reason assessors can't do that, and they are doing it. And we're doing it now, but it's a political, how, you know, federal government is going to continue to raise the CO2, the carbon tax, which is controversial, and it's, you know, it's almost a make and break point in Canadian politics, right? Because the right wing thinks that the carbon tax should be wiped out immediately. It's very interesting. We're at a very important flashpoint in whether we go for an ecological worldview or an industrial worldview. Good point. Thank you for the question.
And did John have something more he wants to say?
I think I do, but I think it's been covered so well. I think that's a brilliant point to end on. If you're going to end it, I think that that would be it. Ted's comment and Jean's in your reply, I think that's a beautiful spot. So if you want to wrap it up, I won't drag out the minutia.
The devil's in the details.
I don't recall we ever decided who was going to thank Frank, but I will. I really enjoyed it, Frank. Maybe Jean is going to too. I actually kind of understand it now, which never happened to me before. And it seems that part of the value of land is where it's located with respect to the clutch of people around in the city. The more dense the people, the more valuable the land is. And so as you get farther away, it's less value. I understand that now, didn't before.
Okay,
So-
Jean Doherty is going to thank the speaker.
Okay.
Thank you, Frank. On behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, it's my pleasure and privilege to be able to thank you for a very thought-provoking talk, one that I had never really considered this, and it's really very interesting to sort of twist my brain around to something completely different. So thank you for that. And I would like to say to everyone who is online at this point to listen, if you are interested in finding out more about our series of speakers and things that have gone on, please go to our website, canadiancore.com, and you can go on to the Stay Informed section and register for that. And there you will see links to all of the talks, including this one when it's ready to go. And you'll be able to see the talks that we've got on YouTube. You can search for them and find them there. So this is an opportunity for anyone to come and do that. It would also be an opportunity for people if they would like to become a member of CACOR and to see more of the things that we do that aren't obvious on the surface here for the talks. So again, go to the canadiancore.com and you'll be able to see our membership application and go from there. I'd also like to say if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel. When you're on the YouTube channel, it will make a big difference for us and it will help us as well. So again, Frank, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. It was a great pleasure, and thank you for the honor.